Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katrina Ashley Chapman. Today is December 9th. Happy holidays. Today we are going to be talking about genetic modifications with regards to pesticides and insecticides. So the article that we were assigned to read actually specifically discussed different techniques that are used today and that are being researched to help use, instead of using what everyone used to use in the past was a lot of the spray pesticides, which can be harmful to humans, and it can also be harmful to the nature in general. So to start off, in the article, they actually discussed sterile insect techniques, also abbreviated as SIT. They discussed a research trial that was done where they basically experimented on moths, fruit flies, and mosquitoes. Basically what they do is they take the insect, and initially with their trials what they were trying to do is they would separate the insects by gender, if they could. Now, and I say if they could because later on during their trials, they realized that this was not an easy task, because if you have a large amount of insects, it's very tedious and time-consuming to sit there and try to split them all off into these separate categories. So that was one drawback of this specific technique. However, during this technique, what they do is they'll split them off. They'll take the males, and they'll pretty much have them feed on something that is dosed with high levels of radiation. So this sterile insect technique typically has to do with the radiation. And the radiation is so high that it actually destroys a gene and prevents them from continuing to populate, pretty much. So this was one technique that they used to help curb pests harming their crops. Now, like I said, it became an issue because then they'd have to sit there and it's very time consuming. It eventually led to another type of technique that we'll discuss here shortly. But that's something that they're still using. It has been successful. However, they have to make sure that they have a proper release ratio when they do this so that they are not eradicating the species. And they're also seeing enough of a drop that it continues to be effective as a quote-unquote insecticide, pesticide for these crops. Because if they're not releasing enough of these sterile males to go and breed with the wild insects, then it's not going to be enough to deter them from pretty much chomping on these awesome crops. However, you also don't want to decimate a species, because that's not the point. The point is to save the crops. Later on, they also use these techniques to help with vector transmission. For example, mosquitoes are known to carry a lot of diseases, so they use similar techniques to help slow down the transmission of some diseases in different countries. But with the SIT technique, basically, they mass rear these males that are sterile, and then they release them, and with that ratio in mind, to go and populate, and then a lot of them will die off because of the radiation that's taking place, and then that will help to keep the population level low. The idea is that they have enough of the dominant trait that is affected, so radiation is going to cause a mutation. That mutation is going to be expressed when they mate. So some of them won't survive past their juvenile stages. Some of them will. If they do, the hope is that the adjusted or mutated gene is transmitted where, depending on how it was designed, where they are either unable to continue to mate, or they're unable to feed off the crops. So there might be just different deformities or different defects that are caused by this specific radiation. Another thing that was later considered in the article was transgenic crops. So basically what they would do is they would take crops in, they call them BT crops, and they would have these crops be grown with certain genetic modifications that actually make these insects not want to eat them as much. And it also kills off their population as well. However, this can cause too much of a drop in the insect population, so then they have to make sure they kind of have a refuge spot within the crops so that they're still encouraging the breeding of these insects, but it's not eradicating or decimating the population. So they kind of have to maintain that ratio, because if these insects are eating too much of these BT crops, they're eventually going to develop a mutation that's going to pretty much allow them to adjust, right? I can't think of the specific word, but it's going to allow them to adjust to these levels in the BT crops, and then they're going to be allowed to survive. So having that refuge area is going to kind of cause that mix-up within the traits, because you don't want the recessive traits that are survivable to take over, because then the population is going to continue to grow and these BT crops are going to be pointless. So they kind of have to find a balance there. The other option, like I was discussing earlier, was the transgenic modifications or the genetic modifications of these specific insects, which they have successfully done with mosquitoes. They'll breed them. There's been CRISPR techniques. In another article I read a few years ago, there was another technique similar to CRISPR, but basically you're knocking out specific genes of the insect that will cause it to be sterile or cause it to produce newer generations with defects that prevent them from eating or prevent them from feeding on humans to pass on these specific viruses. So they've had success in these areas. The big key thing is they want to make sure that they are allowing these crops to survive, but not destroying the insects at the same time. So there's a lot of push and play, a lot of experimentation that has to be done, and of course a lot of trials. But in my opinion, I think that they're on the right track. They are being bioethically sound by making sure they're not destroying these insects, like the entire species. The goal is to make sure that these crops survive, or in the case of vectors, make sure that these diseases are not being transmitted. So they're being very economical in the fact that they're ensuring the survival of the species and trying to get their goal across and make sure that they're meeting that goal of pesticides that are safe and making sure that these diseases are not transmitted.